Everyone thinks of Family Guy as the show that just wants to shock you. Fast jokes, cutaways, nothing sacred. That was the assumption for years. Then GLAAD stepped in. Then a former vice presidential candidate did too. Then the show's own creator admitted, on camera, that some of it went too far. What happens when the jokes stop being jokes is where this one really starts. This is Fall Asleep 2, The Family Guy Obsession. The cancellation and comeback. A genuinely wholesome underdog story. Family Guy started on Fox in January 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which is one of the biggest advertising spots in all of television. Seth MacFarlane created the show while he was still a young writer at another animation studio, and Fox gave him a chance to build something new around a family in a fictional town called Quahog, Rhode Island. Peter Griffin, his wife Lois, their 3 kids, Meg, Chris, and Stewie, along with their talking dog Brian, made up the family at the center of it all. The style was fast, strange, and full of quick jokes that jumped from one idea to another without warning. Landing that Super Bowl slot mattered a great deal for a brand new show with no track record. Networks reserve that kind of airtime for programs they believe in enough to gamble real money on, since the cost of advertising during the biggest television event of the year is enormous. Fox was betting that Family Guy could grab a huge audience already sitting on their couches after the game ended, curious enough to stick around and see what this strange new cartoon was about. That bet paid off in the short term, since the pilot brought in a large number of viewers simply by being in the right place at the right time. Keeping those viewers turned out to be a different problem entirely. Ratings were shaky from the very beginning. Fox moved the show around the schedule again and again, which is something networks do when they are not sure a show fits anywhere. Moving a show around like that usually kills its chances because people forget when to tune in, and Family Guy suffered exactly that kind of confusion. A viewer who liked the show after the Super Bowl premiere might tune back in weeks later, expecting it in the same time slot, only to find something else airing instead. Without a stable night and a stable hour, even a show with real potential struggles to build the kind of steady, loyal audience that keeps a network happy. By the year 2000, only a year after it started, Fox canceled it. This happened quietly, the way most shows disappear, without much warning and without much fuss from the wider public. Cancellation like this is common enough in television that most shows come and go without anyone outside a small circle of fans noticing much at all.
There was no reason, based on how these things usually go, to expect Family Guy to be any different. Something unusual happened next. A group of fans pushed hard enough that Fox brought the show back for a 3rd season. This kind of comeback almost never happens in television. Shows that get canceled almost always stay canceled because networks are looking at money and ratings, not emotional attachment. But enough people wrote letters, made noise online, and showed real anger about losing the show that Fox changed its mind for a little while. This is the first piece of proof for something worth sitting with. Before Family Guy became known for its shock jokes and its darker material, it was already a show that people cared about enough to fight for. Think about how much effort that kind of campaign actually takes. Writing a letter to a television network and mailing it takes more commitment than clicking a button today.
Organizing enough people to do that, spreading the word through whatever early internet forums and message boards existed at the time, required real coordination among fans who had never met each other in person. They were doing all of this for a show that had only produced a small handful of episodes, nowhere near enough time for most shows to build the kind of devoted following capable of mounting a real campaign. Family Guy managed it anyway, within its very first couple of years on the air. The comeback did not last. In 2002, Fox canceled the show again, and this time it looked permanent. 3 seasons and 1 aborted afterlife seemed like the end of the story. Most shows that get canceled twice do not come back a 3rd time. There is no real path back once a network has given up twice. Family Guy should have ended there as a strange little footnote in television history, remembered by a small group of loyal fans and mostly forgotten by everyone else. At this point, the show had every reason to fade away completely. 2 cancellations in 3 years is a rough record for any series, and networks tend to treat a second cancellation as a final decision rather than an invitation for more fan campaigns. Whatever goodwill had brought Family Guy back the first time did not seem likely to work twice. The show's history could easily have ended in 2002 as a minor curiosity, the kind of program television historians mention briefly while writing about other, more successful shows from the same era. What actually happened is one of the strangest and most genuinely heartwarming stories in the history of American television, and it has nothing to do with network executives changing their minds out of kindness. It has everything to do with ordinary people buying DVDs and watching reruns. After the second cancellation, Fox released the first 3 seasons of Family Guy on DVD. These sets sold extremely well, becoming some of the best-selling television DVDs of that entire era. This mattered because DVD sales gave Fox hard proof, in dollars, that people wanted more of the show even after it had been canceled twice. At the exact same time, Cartoon Network's late-night block, known as Adult Swim, started airing reruns of Family Guy. Those reruns became some of the highest-rated programs the network had ever shown. Two separate signals, DVD sales and rerun ratings, were both pointing in the same direction at the same time. People had not stopped watching. They had just lost the ability to see new episodes. Consider how strange this actually is from a business standpoint. Fox had already decided, twice, that Family Guy was not worth continuing. The people at the network responsible for scheduling and ratings had looked at the numbers available to them at the time and concluded the show did not deserve a future.
What changed their minds was not a new pitch from Seth MacFarlane or a passionate speech from anyone at the studio. It was simply watching what people actually did once the show was gone. They kept buying it. They kept tuning into reruns on a different network entirely, one that had nothing to do with the original decision to cancel the show in the first place. DVD sales, in particular, are a very specific kind of signal. Buying a season of a show on DVD means spending real money on something you could otherwise access for free if it were still airing on television. People who bought those DVD sets were not simply watching whatever happened to be on. They were actively seeking out more of a specific show that had already been taken away from them twice, paying for the privilege of watching episodes they may have already seen when they first aired. That kind of purchase says something different about audience loyalty than ratings numbers alone ever could.
In 2005, Fox bought Family Guy back for a fourth season, and this time it was not going anywhere. This is one of the only times in the history of American network television that a canceled show returned to new episodes because of its performance in reruns and on home video, rather than being saved through a direct campaign aimed at the network itself. The first cancellation reversal in 2000 happened because fans protested directly. The second reversal, the one that actually stuck, happened because of quiet, everyday viewing habits that added up into something too big for Fox to ignore. Sit with what this actually means for a moment, because it says something real about the relationship between this show and the people who love it. A television show is, at its core, a business decision made over and over again by people counting numbers. Networks do not usually feel sentimental about content. They feel sentimental about profit and attention.
For Family Guy to come back not once but twice, first through direct fan pressure and then through pure audience behavior showing up in sales charts and ratings reports, tells you that this was never just background noise for the people watching it. It was something people organized around, bought physical copies of, and stayed up late for on a network built for reruns. This matters for the story we are about to walk through, because Family Guy has a reputation, and much of that reputation is built around shock value, mean jokes, and material that pushes past what many other shows would attempt. That reputation is not wrong. There are real, well-documented moments across the show's run where jokes crossed lines that even the people who made the show later admitted were too far. We are going to look at several of those moments honestly, without pretending they did not happen and without softening them.
But before any of that, it is worth remembering that the reason Family Guy exists at all, 25 years after it first aired, is because people genuinely loved it. Not loved it the way you tolerate background noise. Loved it the way you buy something twice, once on television and once on a physical disc, just to keep supporting it. Loved it the way you organize letter writing campaigns to save something that a giant broadcasting company had already decided to throw away. The cancellation and rebirth story is not really about business strategy, even though the numbers are what convinced Fox in the end. It is about a strange, loud, fast-talking cartoon about a family in Rhode Island earning enough real affection from real people that it survived 2 deaths. Most shows only get 1 shot. Family Guy got 3, and it earned every single one of them through the actual behavior of the audience watching at home, not through any kind of clever marketing plan from the studio. There is something almost old-fashioned about this kind of loyalty, especially now that streaming numbers and algorithm-driven recommendations decide most of what gets made and what gets canceled. Back then, in the early 2000s, the way people expressed love for a television show was slower and more physical. You had to actually go to a store and buy a DVD box set. You had to actually stay up late and turn on Cartoon Network at the right hour. There was no button to press that instantly told a company how much you cared. The caring had to show up in behavior over months before anyone in charge of a broadcasting schedule would notice. Family Guy's audience did exactly that, without any coordinated plan, just through thousands of individual choices that all pointed the same way. That is the kind of thing that happens when a show connects with people on a level deeper than just being funny in the moment.
Something about the family at the center of it, the fast rhythm of the jokes, the strange affection between characters who probably should not get along, made enough of an impression that people were
were not ready to let it go, even after Fox had officially decided the show was finished. It is also worth remembering that returning from cancellation did not mean returning to the exact same show. Coming back after such a long gap gave the writers a chance to grow more confident in what Family Guy actually was, rather than what a network executive thought it should be. The show that returned in 2005 leaned harder into its own identity, more willing to push jokes further and build stranger storylines, partly because it had already proven, through DVD sales and reruns, that its audience wanted exactly that kind of material, rather than something safer and more conventional. Keep that image in your head as we move forward, because it will matter later.
A show does not get resurrected twice by accident. Something about Family Guy, even in those first 3 seasons, was doing something right, something that felt worth protecting. The show that eventually built a reputation for going further than almost anything else on television started its life as something people were desperate to keep alive. And once you understand how real that early love was, it becomes much more interesting to sit with the show's other side, the side that produced entire episodes built around genuinely upsetting ideas, jokes that advocacy groups publicly criticized, and choices that even the people who wrote the show later admitted they regretted. The same show that fans fought to save twice is the same show that has spent 25 years testing exactly how far a joke can go before it stops being funny to anyone at all. That contradiction is not an accident of the show existing for a long time. It has been part of Family Guy from very close to the beginning, sitting quietly underneath the surface even during those first 3 seasons that fans loved enough to bring back from the dead. The friendliest, most genuinely emotional relationship on the entire show, the one between a cynical talking dog and a baby with the vocabulary of a grown man, was already forming in those early years. And so was the show's habit of writing entire storylines around ideas that most other programs would never even consider putting into a script. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That relationship between Brian and Stewie is where the warmer side of this contradiction really lives, and it deserves a close look, because it is one of the clearest examples in the whole series of something genuinely tender sitting inside a show that most people only remember for being loud and rude.
Section 2. Brian and Stewie, the real emotional core. Peter and Lois are the parents. Meg and Chris are the older kids who mostly get pushed to the side of the plot. Stewie is the baby, with a grown man's vocabulary and a plan for world domination that never quite works out. And then there is Brian, the family dog, who talks, walks on 2 legs when he wants to, drinks martinis, and has tried more than once to write a novel. On paper, none of this should work as anything more than a joke. A talking dog and a genius baby sound like exactly the kind of gimmick a cartoon uses once and then quietly drops. Family Guy did the opposite. Instead of treating Brian and Stewie as a strange background detail, the show built one of its steadiest and most human relationships around the two of them. Somewhere in the middle of all the fast jokes and the constant cutaways to random ideas, a real friendship grew between a cynical talking dog and a baby who spent his early years plotting to kill his own mother. That friendship is still one of the clearest windows into what Family Guy can do when it slows down and lets 2 characters just exist next to each other. It helps to remember how unusual this pairing was, even by the standards of animated comedy at the time the show began. Cartoons had used talking animals before, and cartoons had used precocious children before, but very few shows had tried building an actual ongoing friendship between the two, treating a family pet and an infant sibling as equals, capable of real conversation and real disagreement. Most shows would have kept Brian as a simple pet, present mostly for a quick visual joke, and kept Stewie as a background gag, limited to a handful of one-liners each episode. Family Guy chose instead to let both characters grow into full, complicated personalities, and then let those 2 personalities collide with each other on a regular basis. Brian was introduced from the start as the most normal member of the household, if a talking dog can be called normal. He reads books, he has opinions about politics that he shares whether anyone asks or not, he worries about his writing career, worries about being taken seriously, and worries about whether his life actually means anything. Underneath the jokes about him being a dog, Brian carries the emotional weight of someone who wanted more from life than he got. He is the character most likely to sit quietly with a drink and think about failure. This kind of character, a dog who behaves and thinks like a disappointed adult human, gives the show a strange kind of freedom. Brian can comment on the world the way none of the human characters easily could, since his position as a pet lets him observe the family from just enough distance to notice things about them that they might miss about themselves. At the same time, his own frustrations about his writing, about his romantic relationships, about whether he has actually accomplished anything worth being proud of, give him a
kind of interior life that goes well beyond what a talking animal usually gets in an animated show. Stewie arrived as something completely different. A baby, barely able to walk without help from the rest of the family, speaking in a clipped accent and carrying himself like a small dictator who has not yet built his army. Early episodes leaned hard into Stewie's plotting against Lois, his mother, treating the idea of a baby wanting to kill his own mom as one of the show's boldest running jokes. Stewie talked about world domination the way other kids talk about wanting a new toy.
None of the other characters in the house could fully understand him, since to them he was still just a baby babbling nonsense. Brian was the one exception. Brian could hear every word.
This detail is easy to skip past quickly, but it shapes almost everything about how the show is able to use Stewie at all. Because the rest of the family hears only baby noises when Stewie speaks, the writers get to have him say almost anything, no matter how dark or strange, without needing to explain why nobody calls the police or takes him to a specialist. The joke only works because of this one specific rule the show sets up early and sticks to closely. Brian breaking that rule, being the single character who actually hears Stewie's real words, is what turns a simple gag into the foundation for an entire relationship. That single detail changes everything about how their relationship works. Brian is the only person in Stewie's world who actually understands what Stewie is saying and doing.
Everyone else, including Stewie's own parents, treats him like a regular infant, cooing at him and changing his diapers without any idea that he is plotting something upstairs in his room with actual blueprints. Brian sees Stewie clearly, plans, threats, loneliness, and all, and chooses to stick around anyway. That decision, made quietly across dozens of episodes rather than stated outright in any single one, is the foundation the entire friendship stands on. Because Brian understands Stewie in a way nobody else in the house does, the two of them end up depending on each other in ways that go beyond convenience. Stewie needs someone who will actually listen to his plans and take them seriously, even if that someone spends half the time rolling his eyes. Brian, meanwhile, gets something out of the relationship too. Around Stewie, Brian gets to be smarter than someone, gets to feel like the responsible adult in the room, even while talking to a toddler. For a character who often feels overlooked by the rest of the household, being the one person Stewie actually respects gives Brian a kind of quiet importance he does not get anywhere else. This dynamic becomes especially clear in the episodes built specifically around the two of them traveling somewhere together. Family Guy has a whole line of episodes, often grouped under the name Road to, each one sending Brian and Stewie off on a trip away from the rest of the family. Road to Rhode Island sends them across the country together. Road to Europe, Road to Germany, and Road to the Multiverse all follow the same basic shape, dropping the pair into a new setting far from home, and letting the story focus entirely on how they handle each other along the way. These episodes work as a kind of pressure test for the friendship. Take away the rest of the family, take away the usual setting, and see what is actually left between these two characters when nothing else is distracting from it. Each of these trips places the pair into a completely different kind of pressure. Road to Rhode Island forces them to survive a cross-country drive together, dealing with car trouble and each other's worst habits along the way. Road to Europe sends them overseas on an entirely different kind of mission, surrounded by unfamiliar surroundings that strip away any comfort of home. Road to Germany drops them into a much heavier setting, forcing the two of them to navigate history and danger together, rather than simple comedy alone. Road to the Multiverse takes the idea even further, sending them across entirely different versions of reality, each one testing the friendship against a stranger set of circumstances than the last. Despite how different each of these settings is, the core relationship holds the same basic shape every time. Two very different characters figuring out again and again that they would rather face something difficult together than alone. What is left, again and again, turns out to be something surprisingly tender. Stripped of the constant background noise from Peter and the rest of the family, Brian and Stewie start acting less like a joke pairing and more like an actual pair of friends who annoy each other, worry about each other, and eventually look out for each other. Stewie, who spends most of his time at home either scheming or being ignored, gets to be genuinely needed on these trips. Brian, who spends a lot of his time at home feeling like nobody listens to him, gets to be the one adult figure Stewie actually trusts to keep him safe. One of the clearest examples of this bond getting real weight instead of just being a punchline is the episode simply called Brian and Stewie, which aired during the show's 6th season. Unlike most Family Guy episodes, this one strips almost everything else away. The entire episode centers on Brian and Stewie getting locked inside a bank vault together overnight, with almost no one else appearing on screen for most of the runtime. There is no big adventure across the country here, no wild cutaway jokes interrupting
interrupting every few seconds. It is simply two characters trapped in a small space, forced to actually talk to each other for an extended stretch of time. That kind of setup, sometimes called a bottle episode because the story stays contained in one location, is a format many shows use specifically to dig deeper into a relationship than the regular episodes allow. Family Guy, choosing to use that format on Brian and Stewie, rather than on Peter and Lois or any other pairing in the family, says something about which relationship the writers considered strong enough to hold an entire episode without any outside help.
Locked in that vault, with nothing else to distract from it, the two of them talk about fear, mortality, and what they actually mean to each other, in a way the show rarely allows itself to slow down for anywhere else. Choosing a bank vault specifically, rather than any other enclosed space, also adds a certain weight to the setting. A vault is built to keep things safe, sealed away from danger, and yet the episode uses that same space to strip away every safety net the two characters normally rely on. No family nearby, no easy escape, nothing to distract them from each other. The contrast between what the location is meant to represent and what actually happens inside it gives the episode a quiet kind of tension that a more ordinary setting would not have provided nearly as well. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it goes against almost everything people assume about this show from the outside. Family Guy has a reputation built on speed, chaos, and jokes that arrive and disappear within seconds, jumping from one random idea to the next before anyone has time to think too hard about what they just watched. An entire episode willing to lock two characters in a vault and simply let them talk, with the humor taking a back seat to something closer to real feeling, does not match that reputation at all. And yet, it happened, using exactly the two characters who had already been quietly building this kind of trust across dozens of earlier episodes. Even outside of the big trip episodes and the vault episode, the pattern holds throughout the regular run of the show. When Stewie is scared, confused, or facing something too big for a baby to handle alone, Brian is very often the one he turns to. When Brian is going through one of his frequent bouts of feeling like his life has amounted to nothing, Stewie is often the one small voice cutting through the self-pity, sometimes with an insult, sometimes with something closer to real support. Neither of them talks about the friendship directly very often. That is part of what makes it feel real rather than staged. Real friendships, especially between two people who would never admit out loud how much they need each other, usually work exactly like this, through small gestures and shared time, rather than speeches about how much they care. There is also something worth noticing about how mismatched these two characters are on the surface, and how that mismatch is exactly what makes the relationship interesting. Brian is an adult, at least in dog years, someone who has lived enough of life to be disappointed by it already. Stewie is a literal infant, even if his vocabulary and his plans suggest otherwise. A friendship between someone jaded and someone brand new to the world could easily feel forced or strange. Instead, the show uses that gap well. Brian gets to play the tired, more experienced friend who has seen enough to know that most plans fail and most dreams get smaller than expected. Stewie, despite being a baby, often pushes back against that tiredness, refusing to let Brian settle into total defeat, even while being far too young to actually understand what defeat means. This gap in age and experience also lets the show flip the usual roles a viewer might expect from a friendship like this. In most stories pairing an adult with a much younger companion, the adult is the one offering wisdom, and the child is the one needing guidance. Family Guy frequently reverses that expectation. Stewie, despite being an infant, often ends up pushing Brian toward action, refusing to let him wallow, needling him out of his self-pity with a bluntness that someone his age technically should not be capable of. Brian, despite being the more experienced of the two, often needs that push, since his own tendency toward overthinking and disappointment can leave him stuck in a way that Stewie's more direct, less filtered outlook helps break through. Seth MacFarlane has talked in interviews over the years about the influence behind Stewie's voice and manner, describing an inspiration drawn from a certain kind of clipped, aristocratic English delivery, similar to actors known for playing sharp, fast-talking characters from an earlier era of film. That specific choice, giving a baby the voice and bearing of a much older, more sophisticated character, is part of why Stewie never quite feels like a normal cartoon baby. He talks like someone who has already lived a full life somewhere else and got dropped into a crib by mistake. Pairing a voice and personality like that against Brian's much more familiar, everyday kind of disappointment creates a contrast that gives their scenes together a specific kind of energy none of the other family pairings really match. This vocal choice does more work than it might seem to on the surface. A baby who sounded like an ordinary child, even a smart one, would likely come across as simply precocious, a familiar type audiences have seen in other shows. Giving Stewie a voice modeled on something older
clever and more theatrical instead makes him sound like he belongs to a completely different kind of story than the one happening around him, which is part of why his scenes with Brian, another character who often sounds and thinks like someone older than his actual role in the household, click together so naturally.
None of this erases the darker material connected to Stewie, and it should not try to. During the same years that this friendship with Brian was quietly deepening, Stewie's character was also built around repeated jokes and entire storylines involving his desire to kill his own mother. Both things are true about the same character at the same time. The show never really tried to hide one side to protect the other. Stewie could spend an episode planning something disturbing involving Lois, and then spend the very next episode leaning on Brian for comfort after a nightmare, without the show treating those two things as a contradiction that needed explaining. That refusal to smooth things over is actually one of the most honest things about how Family Guy built these two characters. Real people, and apparently strange cartoon dogs and babies too, do not sort neatly into one mood or one motive for an entire episode, let alone an entire series.
Stewie can be a genuinely warm friend to Brian, and a genuinely troubling presence in scenes involving his mother, sometimes within the same handful of episodes. The show never asks anyone to pick a side on who Stewie really is underneath it all. It simply keeps showing both, over and over, letting the warmth exist right next to the more troubling material without much comment. This matters for understanding the show as a whole, not just this one friendship. Brian and Stewie prove that Family Guy is capable of real, sustained tenderness between characters when the writers choose to slow down and let it happen. The bottle episode in the bank vault, the mini Road to episodes built entirely around their travels together, and the countless smaller scenes scattered throughout the series where one leans on the other, all add up to something that could not exist by accident.
A show does not build this much consistency into a single relationship unless the people writing it actually care about that relationship working. At the same time, this same show, built by the same writers in the same years, produced entire storylines treating a baby's desire to murder his mother as one of its signature running jokes. The kindness between Brian and Stewie and the disturbing material tied to Stewie's plans for Lois were never kept apart from each other. They existed side by side, often within the very same episodes, which makes the contrast between them far more interesting than if the show had simply kept its warm material and its dark material in separate boxes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That contrast is the whole reason this show is worth looking at closely, instead of writing off as either simply sweet or simply shocking.
Brian and Stewie show the sweet side clearly enough that nobody could honestly deny it exists. What comes next shows the other side just as clearly, and it starts with the exact same baby who spends half his screen time as Brian's closest friend, plotting in full and specific detail to end his own mother's life. Section 3. Stewie kills Lois / Lois kills Stewie. Season 6. Family Guy had already spent 5 seasons building Stewie as a baby with plans nobody else in the house took seriously. His mother Lois had heard him talk about wanting her gone more times than anyone could count, always brushing it off as baby talk, since to her, he was just a toddler making strange noises. Season 6 changed that completely, turning years of throwaway lines into a 2-part story that finally treated Stewie's threats as something real, instead of something funny to laugh off and forget by the next scene. By this point in the show's run, audiences had grown so used to Stewie's matricide jokes that the threat itself had become almost comforting in its familiarity. A viewer tuning into any random episode from the first 5 seasons could expect, at some point, a passing line from Stewie about ending his mother's life, delivered with the same casual tone he might use to complain about a broken toy. The joke worked precisely because nobody, inside the show or watching it, believed anything would ever actually come of it. Turning that comfortable assumption into an actual plot required the writers to break a promise the show had been making to its audience for years. The promise that this particular running gag would always stay a joke and nothing more. The story begins at Stewie's birthday party. Family Guy had shown birthday parties before, usually filled with the same kind of chaos found in most episodes. Relatives arguing, Peter doing something embarrassing, and background jokes running through the whole scene. This party starts out the same way, crowded with family and friends, presents piled up, the usual noise of a household celebration. Then, in the middle of everything, a gunshot rings out, and Lois falls to the ground, shot and badly hurt. Choosing a birthday party as the setting for this moment carries its own kind of weight. Birthdays are supposed to be occasions built around celebrating a child, surrounded by people who care about him, filled with cake and presents and the general warmth families are supposed to show each other on days meant to mark another year of a child's
child's life, turning that exact setting into the scene of an attempted murder, orchestrated by the very child being celebrated, gives the opening of this story a kind of dramatic irony that a more ordinary setting could never have matched. The show did not need to explain why this particular choice mattered. The contrast between the occasion and the crime did that work on its own. The rest of the first episode focuses on the mystery of who actually pulled the trigger. This kind of structure, where a show suddenly turns into a whodunit, was unusual for Family Guy at the time. Most episodes solve their own problems within the same 22 minutes and move on without looking back. Building an entire episode and then a second one right after it around a single unanswered question, who shot Lois, was a much bigger swing than the show normally took. A whodunit format asks something specific of its audience that a normal Family Guy episode never really does. It asks viewers to pay close attention, to remember small details, to weigh suspects against each other and form their own theories before the truth comes out. Most of the show's usual humor depends on the opposite kind of viewing experience. Quick jokes that land and disappear without requiring the audience to track anything across multiple scenes. Shifting into a genuine mystery structure meant slowing down the show's usual rhythm considerably, giving scenes room to build suspicion and plant clues rather than simply moving from one gag to the next. Suspicion quickly lands on Peter. He had motive, since the show had spent years showing a marriage full of arguments, frustration, and moments where Peter clearly felt overwhelmed by Lois and by the responsibilities of the household. The evidence against him piles up fast, some of it circumstantial, some of it built on his own past behavior, and the episode moves him toward a trial with the kind of speed that leaves very little room for anyone, inside the show or watching it, to consider other suspects seriously. Peter is arrested, put on trial, and ultimately found guilty of shooting his own wife. He is sentenced to prison, and the family is left to deal with a version of their lives where the father has been locked away for a crime that the audience, thanks to earlier scenes, already knows he almost certainly did not commit. Watching Peter's trial unfold carries a particular kind of discomfort, since the audience is placed in a position most courtroom stories try to avoid. Normally, a story wants its audience uncertain about guilt right alongside the characters inside the story, discovering the truth at the same pace as everyone else. Family Guy instead lets viewers see enough, through earlier scenes and through Stewie's behavior, to suspect the trial is heading toward the wrong conclusion well before it actually happens. Watching an innocent man convicted while already sensing the real story is far more unsettling than a straightforward mystery would have been, since there is no comfortable distance between the audience and the unfairness playing out on screen. This is where the story starts pulling directly from the years of setup around Stewie. Flashbacks scattered through the two episodes reveal that Stewie had been planning to kill Lois for a long time, going back through small hints the show had dropped across earlier seasons without ever following through on them. The show had spent years letting Stewie talk about matricide as one of his defining traits, a joke repeated so often that most viewers had stopped expecting it to ever actually happen. Stewie kills Lois takes that joke and turns it into an actual event inside the story, revealing that Stewie was the one who pulled the trigger at his own birthday party. Using flashbacks specifically to reveal this truth lets the show reach back into its own history in a way a normal episode rarely attempts. Rather than simply having Stewie confess outright or having another character stumble onto the truth by accident, the flashback structure invites the audience to reconsider everything they thought they understood about years of earlier jokes. Lines that once seemed like harmless comedy get reframed, in hindsight, as evidence of a plan that had actually been building the entire time. This kind of storytelling, using the show's own history against itself, gives the reveal a weight that a fresh, unconnected plot twist could never carry on its own. Brian is the character who eventually puts the pieces together. Given everything covered in the previous section about how close Brian and Stewie had grown over the years, and how Brian was the only member of the household who ever fully understood what Stewie was capable of, it makes sense that he becomes the one who uncovers the truth. Brian starts noticing small details that do not add up, behavior from Stewie that feels off compared to everything else happening around the trial, and slowly works his way toward realizing that his closest friend in the house is the one actually responsible for shooting Lois and letting Peter take the blame for it. It matters that the show chose Brian for this role rather than any other character available to it. Lois herself could have slowly regained a memory of the shooting. A detective character could have been introduced specifically to solve the case from the outside. Instead, the show relied on the one relationship it had spent years building carefully in the background, using Brian's closeness to Stewie as the actual mechanism that unravels the mystery. This choice ties the entire storyline directly back to the friendship covered earlier in this piece, making the mystery plot and the emotional plot inseparable from each other, rather than two separate stories running side by side. The moment Brian confronts Stewie with what he has figured out carries real weight, precisely because of everything built between these two characters in earlier seasons and in the previous section covered here. This is not a stranger accusing Stewie of something. This is the one character who has spent years defending him, traveling with him, getting locked in a bank vault with him, and choosing again and again to stick by him despite knowing exactly how dangerous his plans could be.
Brian finding out that Stewie really did try to kill his own mother and that an innocent man is currently sitting in prison because of it puts their entire friendship under a kind of pressure it had never faced before. Stewie's reaction to being caught does not follow the usual pattern of a cartoon villain getting exposed. He does not simply deny it or try to talk his way out of it with a clever excuse. Instead, once Brian confronts him directly, Stewie owns up to what he did, and the story shifts into something closer to a partnership between the two of them, working together to figure out what happens next, rather than Brian simply turning against his friend the moment he learns the truth. This choice matters because it keeps the friendship established in the previous section intact, even while dealing directly with the worst thing Stewie has ever actually done, rather than just talked about doing. This decision to keep Brian and Stewie working together, rather than splitting them into opposing sides once the truth comes out, says something specific about how the show wanted this story to feel. A different version of this same plot could easily have used the reveal as the moment the friendship finally breaks, with Brian turning Stewie in out of basic decency toward the rest of the family. Family Guy chose instead to test the friendship without destroying it, letting loyalty and complicated feelings about right and wrong exist together, rather than forcing a clean, simple resolution where one side wins out completely over the other. From here, the second half of the story turns into something far bigger and stranger than a normal Family Guy episode. Once the truth about Stewie is out in the open between him and Brian, the two of them end up on the run together, trying to work out how to fix what has happened without simply turning Stewie over to be punished for attempted murder.
What follows is an extended chase across changing locations, filled with action movie-style sequences that look and feel completely different from the show's usual pace. Cars crash, escapes happen, and the story keeps raising the stakes in a way that mimics big-budget action films, rather than a half-hour cartoon comedy. This shift in tone and pacing is worth noticing on its own. Family Guy typically moves through jokes at a rapid pace, rarely holding on any single sequence long enough to build sustained tension. The chase sequences, running through the back half of this story, slow that rhythm down considerably, borrowing pacing and structure more commonly found in serious action filmmaking.
Extended chases, close calls, and mounting danger require a very different kind of patience from both the writers and the audience than the show's usual quick cutaway style. And the willingness to commit to that shift for an extended stretch shows how seriously the writers were treating this particular story compared to a normal week's episode. At one point, the story jumps forward into a future version of the world, showing what things might look like years down the line if the situation around Lois, Peter, and Stewie is never resolved. This kind of jump, skipping ahead to show consequences stretching far beyond a single episode, was rare for the show at that point in its run. Most Family Guy stories reset completely by the time the credits roll, with almost nothing from one episode changing anything in the next. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie broke that pattern on purpose, showing that this particular story was going to carry weight the writers were not planning to simply erase by the next commercial break. Showing a future where nothing gets resolved forces the audience to sit with the real cost of what has happened, rather than trusting that everything will simply snap back to normal by the credits. It briefly removes the safety net viewers usually rely on with this show, the comfortable knowledge that no matter how dark things get, the family will be fine again by next week. Letting that safety net disappear, even temporarily, raises the emotional stakes of the entire two-part story considerably, making the eventual resolution feel more like something the characters actually earned, rather than something the format simply guaranteed from the start. Eventually, the story finds its way back to a resolution that restores the family to something close to normal. Lois survives. Peter is cleared of the crime he did not commit. Stewie's role in the shooting gets folded back into the ongoing world of the show without permanently changing the day-to-day setup that Family Guy relies on to keep running season after season. The exact mechanics of how the show pulls this reset off matter less than the fact that it happens at all, since even here, in an episode built around a child shooting his own mother, the show ultimately chooses to bring its family back together rather than leave them permanently broken by what happened. What makes this two-part story worth examining closely is not really the plot mechanics of who did what and how it all got fixed. It is the fact that the show spent years treating Stewie's desire to kill his mother as one of its most reliable running jokes, and then, in season 6, decided to actually follow through
through on that joke as a real plot instead of just another line thrown away in the middle of an unrelated scene.
Turning a running gag into an actual attempted murder, complete with an innocent man convicted and sent to prison for it, is a very different kind of choice than simply having Stewie mutter another line about wanting Lois gone and moving on to the next joke. Consider how differently this material would land on almost any other television show, animated or otherwise. A storyline built around a baby actually shooting his mother, followed by that baby's father being wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for the crime, sounds like something from a serious crime drama rather than a comedy aimed at a broad audience. Family Guy took that exact premise and ran with it across 2 full episodes, keeping enough jokes and cutaways scattered throughout to remind viewers they were still watching a comedy, while never fully softening how dark the underlying story actually was.
This is also where the friendship explored in the previous section gets tested in a way nothing else in the show's run really matches. Brian spent years being the one character who could see Stewie clearly, understanding both the plans and the loneliness sitting underneath them, and choosing to stay close to him anyway. Learning that Stewie really did shoot Lois, and that an innocent member of the family was suffering because of it, forces Brian into a position where loyalty to his friend and basic decency toward the rest of the family pull in 2 different directions at once. The show does not spend a huge amount of time dwelling on this tension in a serious, slow-moving way, since Family Guy rarely slows down for very long, no matter how heavy the material gets. But the tension is there, sitting underneath the action sequences and the jokes, giving the whole storyline a kind of weight that a lot of casual viewers might miss on a first watch. It is worth remembering, too, that this entire storyline exists because the show had spent years setting up Stewie's obsession with killing his mother as something safe to laugh at, precisely because nobody expected it to ever really happen. Jokes about Stewie's plans against Lois had shown up in episode after episode, going back to the earliest seasons, always framed as harmless because Stewie was, after all, just a baby with big ideas that would obviously never go anywhere. Stewie kills Lois takes that comfortable assumption and removes it completely, following through on years of build-up, in a way that turns a running joke into an actual, consequence-filled event within the story. That choice says something important about how Family Guy operates as a whole.
The show is willing to let jokes sit for years, repeated so often that audiences stop expecting them to mean anything, and then suddenly cash those jokes in for a story that treats them with far more seriousness than anyone was prepared for. This pattern shows up again and again across the show's run in different forms, but few examples are as sharp or as clear as watching Stewie's matricide jokes finally turn into an actual shooting, an actual wrongful conviction, and an actual test of the one friendship in the house built on someone actually understanding him. None of this cancels out what was covered about Brian and Stewie in the previous section. If anything, this storyline only works because of everything already established between them. Brian's decision to work with Stewie, rather than immediately turning against him once he learns the truth, only makes sense because of years of built-up trust and shared history between the 2 characters.
The warmth from the earlier section and the darkness running through this one are not separate stories happening to separate characters. They are the same relationship, tested under very different kinds of pressure, showing both sides of what Family Guy is willing to do with the same 2 characters, depending on what kind of story it wants to tell in a given season. This is also a useful moment to notice how differently the show treats consequences, depending on which storyline it is telling. Many Family Guy episodes let characters do outrageous, sometimes genuinely harmful things without much lasting effect on the world around them, resetting almost everything by the start of the next episode. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie stand out precisely because they refuse to fully do that. An innocent man goes to prison. A mother gets shot at her own son's birthday party. A friendship gets tested by the discovery of an actual attempted murder. Even with the eventual return to a more normal status for the family, the show lets these events carry real narrative weight across 2 full episodes in a way it rarely allows itself elsewhere. Sit for a moment with how strange it is that a show capable of producing something this heavy is the same show fans fought twice to bring back from cancellation. The same show that also produced the quiet, genuinely touching bank vault episode built entirely around Brian and Stewie's friendship. These are not 2 different shows pretending to be one. They are the exact same show, made by the exact same writers, often within the very same handful of seasons, choosing again and again to place real tenderness directly next to real darkness, without asking viewers to pick one side as the true version of what Family Guy actually is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
relentlessly.
This tension between warmth and harm does not stay contained to Stewie and the people directly around him. Other members of the Griffin household carry the same kind of contradiction in different forms, and the next part of this story moves toward a member of the family who exists almost entirely outside the human cast, whose fate became one of the clearest real-world examples of just how much audiences actually cared about characters they had spent years watching, even when that character was, on paper, nothing more than a talking dog. Section 4. The Death and Resurrection of Brian, Season 12. By the time Season 12 of Family Guy rolled around, the show had been running for well over a decade, and Brian the dog had been part of the family since the very first episode.
Fans had watched him grow from a strange gimmick into one of the most fully realized characters on the show. The one member of the household who read books, worried about his writing career, and quietly carried more sadness than almost anyone else in Quahog. After everything covered in the earlier sections about his friendship with Stewie and the way that bond had been tested during the shooting storyline, Brian had become one of the characters people simply assumed would always be there, season after season, no matter what else happened on the show. 12 seasons is a long time for any character to sit in the same house, aging in dog years while the rest of the family barely moves forward at all. Across that stretch, Brian had gone through failed relationships, failed writing projects, failed attempts to feel like his life amounted to something more than fetching newspapers and drinking martinis on the couch. None of it ever really changed his circumstances by much, but the steady repetition of his disappointments gave him a kind of permanence in viewers' minds. He was the character who never quite got what he wanted, and somehow that made him easier to relate to than almost anyone else in the house, since most people watching at home understood exactly what it felt like to keep trying at something without ever quite breaking through. That assumption broke apart on November 24th, 2013, when an episode called Life of Brian aired. In the episode, Brian is struck by a car in the street outside the Griffin house. The injury is serious enough that the rest of the episode deals directly with his death, showing the family gathered around him in his final moments, and then dealing with the aftermath of losing him for good. This was not a joke that got walked back by the end of the episode, and it was not a dream sequence or a fake out designed to scare the audience for a few minutes before returning everything to normal. Brian died on screen in an episode built specifically around that death and what it meant for everyone left behind. The episode does not rush past this moment the way a typical Family Guy episode might rush past almost anything else. The show slows its usual pace down considerably, giving the family real time to react, to grieve, and to sit with the loss, rather than moving quickly toward the next joke. This alone marks the episode as something different from the show's normal rhythm. Family Guy has spent its entire run training its audience to expect a joke around every corner, never lingering too long on any single emotional beat. Life of Brian breaks that training on purpose, forcing viewers to actually feel the weight of losing a character they had spent over a decade watching.
For a show that resets almost everything by the start of each new episode, this was an enormous departure from how Family Guy usually operates. Characters get hurt, embarrassed, and thrown into wild situations constantly, but very rarely does anything permanent happen to a member of the main cast. Killing off Brian, one of only 6 characters who had been part of the show since its very first episode, was a decision large enough that it made headlines outside of the usual entertainment coverage most animated sitcoms receive. This was treated, correctly, as a real event in the life of a major television show, not just another strange twist in a normal episode. Part of what made this decision so significant is how rarely long-running animated shows are willing to touch their own foundation this directly.
Shows built to run for decades tend to protect their core cast almost completely, understanding that audiences return week after week partly because of the comfort of knowing certain characters will always be there. Removing one of only 6 characters present since the very beginning meant tampering with something the show itself seemed to treat as untouchable for its entire history up to that point. Whatever the reasoning behind the decision, it signaled a willingness to disrupt the show's own foundation in a way very few similar programs have ever attempted with a character this central. The show did not leave the Griffin family without a dog for very long. In the very next episode, the family adopts a new dog named Vinny. Vinny was voiced by Tony Sirico, an actor widely known for playing a mobster on the television show The Sopranos, and the character brought a completely different personality into the house, speaking with a thick accent and a blunt, streetwise attitude that stood in sharp contrast to Brian's more bookish, anxious style. Bringing in an actor connected so strongly to a specific, well-known role from another major television series was a clear signal that the show wanted Vinny's arrival to feel like a real event, too, not just a quiet replacement slipped in without much thought. Casting an actor this recognizable for a character meant to replace someone as beloved as Brian
Brian carried its own kind of risk.
Viewers familiar with the actor's most famous role would inevitably bring that association into how they viewed Vinny from his very first appearance, creating a strange kind of double awareness, where audiences were watching a new character while also mentally comparing him to both the role the actor was known for and the character he had come to replace. This casting choice suggests the show understood it was asking a great deal of its audience, expecting them to accept a genuinely different personality into a space that had belonged to one specific character for well over a decade. None of this softened the reaction from the people actually watching the show. Brian's death set off one of the strongest waves of audience backlash in the show's entire history. Fans expressed anger and sadness across social media, and an online petition calling for Brian to be brought back gathered a very large number of signatures within a short period of time. News outlets that do not normally cover cartoon plot lines in much detail ran stories specifically about the reaction to Brian's death, treating it as a real moment of public interest, rather than a small item buried in entertainment coverage. This kind of widespread, immediate reaction is rare for any television character, animated or otherwise, and it said something important about how much genuine attachment had built up around Brian over more than a decade on the air. The scale of this reaction is worth sitting with for a moment. Online petitions exist for all sorts of causes, most of them gathering only a small number of signatures before fading into obscurity. A petition tied specifically to a fictional dog's death, reaching a large number of signatures within days, shows a level of organized, immediate public feeling that goes well beyond the usual chatter that follows most television plot twists. People were not simply commenting that they found the episode sad. They were actively organizing, seeking each other out online, and demanding a specific outcome from a television studio, treating the fictional death with a seriousness usually reserved for causes involving real-world stakes. Seth MacFarlane and the rest of the people behind the show addressed the reaction directly in interviews at the time, acknowledging just how strong the response had been. The scale of the backlash became part of the story itself, discussed in entertainment news alongside the actual plot of the episode. A cartoon dog dying inside a half-hour comedy generated enough real-world attention that the people who made the show had to respond publicly to explain what they were doing and why. This kind of public response from the creative team itself is not something that happens after most plot developments on any show, comedy or otherwise. Writers and producers typically let their work speak for itself, responding to audience reaction only occasionally and usually in fairly brief statements. The fact that this particular decision required repeated public comment across multiple interviews shows how unusual the entire situation had become. The people responsible for the show were not simply promoting an upcoming episode, they were managing a genuine wave of public concern, treating the audience's feelings as something that needed direct acknowledgement rather than something to simply wait out. The resolution came quickly. On December 15, 2013, just 3 weeks after Brian's death first aired, an episode called Christmas Guy brought him back. The show had already established across earlier seasons that Stewie owns a working time machine, a device he built himself and had used before to travel through different points in history and his own life. Christmas Guy uses that same time machine as the way back to Brian. Stewie travels back to before the car accident and manages to prevent it from happening at all, which restores Brian to the present day, alive and completely unharmed, as though the death had never occurred in the timeline the family actually lives in going forward. Using the time machine as the solution ties this resolution directly back to the friendship covered earlier in this piece. It is not a stranger or an unrelated plot device that brings Brian back. It is Stewie, the one character who understands Brian more completely than anyone else in the household, taking direct action to undo the one loss that mattered more to him than almost anything else the show has ever put him through. This choice keeps the emotional core of the resolution focused squarely on the same relationship that has carried so much of the show's genuine warmth since its earliest seasons. Vinny does not disappear without any kind of send-off. The show gives him a proper exit once Brian returns, having him move on from the Griffin house on reasonably good terms, rather than simply vanishing without explanation. Still, the core outcome is clear and simple. Brian is back, permanently, and the show has continued with him as a regular character in every season since, with no further attempt to kill him off again in the years that followed. Giving Vinny a proper departure, rather than simply erasing him from the story, shows a certain amount of care on the show's part, even in the middle of correcting what had clearly become an unpopular decision. Rather than pretending Vinny had never existed, the show acknowledges his presence had been real within its own story, closing that chapter cleanly before moving forward with Brian restored to his usual place. This small detail suggests the writers understood that simply erasing Vinny without any resolution would have felt as dismissive to the character, however short-lived, as ignoring the audience's reaction
reaction to Brian's death would have felt to the fans who had organized against it. Stepping back from the plot mechanics for a moment, this entire sequence of episodes says something worth paying close attention to about the relationship between a long-running show and the people who watch it. Family Guy is often remembered, and often criticized, for treating its characters roughly, throwing them into painful or embarrassing situations purely for a laugh, without much concern for whether anyone in the audience feels protective of them. The response to Brian's death shows the flip side of that same relationship. After more than a decade of watching him worry about his writing, watching him lean on Stewie during hard moments, and watching him serve as the one voice of reason in a house full of chaos, a large number of people had grown genuinely attached to him, the same way people grow attached to characters on shows built entirely around serious drama. This matters for the bigger picture this whole essay is building toward. A show capable of producing jokes and storylines that plenty of people find genuinely upsetting is also a show that managed, over the course of more than a decade, to build a character real enough that killing him off caused a wave of public anger and grief loud enough to reach mainstream news coverage. Both of these things are true about Family Guy at the exact same time, and neither one cancels out the other. The show that fans defended fiercely enough to bring back from 2 real cancellations in its early years is the exact same show that more than a decade later, fans defended just as fiercely when one of its own characters was taken away inside the story itself. There is also something worth noticing in how quickly the show reversed course once the reaction became clear. 3 weeks is a very short window in television production, especially for a decision as large as undoing a major character death. Whether the return was always part of the original plan from the very beginning, or whether the intensity of the audience response sped up a decision that might otherwise have taken longer, the show did not sit with Brian's absence for very long. Whatever the exact reasoning behind the timing, the result was the same. Brian came back, the show course-corrected in a way it almost never allows itself to do, and Vinny, despite arriving with a recognizable actor attached to the role, ended up as a short-term chapter rather than a permanent replacement. This whole sequence also reveals something about how differently Family Guy treats its 2 most beloved characters compared to how it treats almost everyone else. Meg, one of the Griffin children, has been the target of some of the show's harshest and most repeated jokes for years, treated by nearly everyone in the household as an easy punching bag, with very little pushback from the story itself. Brian, by contrast, gets protected in a much more careful way, even while dealing with heavy material like his own death. The show clearly understands which of its characters carry real emotional weight with the audience, and which ones it can treat more roughly without expecting a serious backlash. Brian's death and quick return proved that the writers were fully aware of exactly how much affection had built up around him, and that awareness shaped how carefully they handled undoing his death once the reaction made that awareness impossible to ignore. Sit with the timeline one more time, because the shape of it says a lot. 3 episodes, 21 days between Brian's death airing and his return. An entire public conversation playing out across social media and mainstream news that started and finished within less than a month. Very few storylines on any television show move through public attention that quickly, from shock to anger to relief, all tied to a single animal character on an adult animated comedy. That speed is itself a kind of evidence. Nobody spends that much energy responding to the death of a character they do not actually care about. This event, more than almost anything else covered in the earlier sections about Stewie or the friendship between Brian and Stewie, shows the depth of the audience's actual investment in this show from the outside, measured in real-world reaction rather than anything happening only inside the story. The cancellation and comeback covered earlier proved that people wanted more of the show itself. Brian's death and quick return proved something slightly different, and in some ways even stronger. It proved that people had grown attached not just to the show as a whole, but to a specific character inside it, closely enough that losing him, even for 3 weeks, felt like a real loss worth being upset about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Losing Brian for 3 weeks upset an entire audience. What happens next involves a different kind of pain altogether, aims not at a fictional dog, but at one of the show's own human characters. And the target of that pain has generated some of the loudest real criticism the show has ever faced. Section 5. Meg Griffin and the Everyone Hates Meg runs. Meg Griffin has been part of the family since the very first episode of Family Guy, standing alongside Peter, Lois, Chris, Stewie, and Brian as one of the 6 characters who have appeared in every single season of the show. Unlike Stewie, whose darkest material eventually became an actual plot with real consequences, and unlike Brian, whose death set off genuine public grief, Meg's story runs in almost the opposite direction. She is the one character the show treats worst on a daily basis, not through one big storyline, but through a steady,
steady, ongoing pattern spread across hundreds of episodes, and that pattern has become one of the most talked about parts of the entire series. From early on, the show settled into a habit of using Meg as the target of jokes from almost everyone else in the house. Peter regularly says cruel things directly to her about her appearance or her lack of popularity. Lois criticizes her far more sharply than she does any of her other children. Chris, her own brother, joins in more often than defends her. Even Brian, who spends so much of the show being the voice of reason and decency, has taken part in jokes at Meg's expense more than once. Stewie, the baby who spent years plotting against his own mother, treats Meg with open contempt in a huge number of episodes, insulting her looks and her worth as a person with a casualness that stands out even by the show's own standards. This pattern did not stay confined to any single season or storyline. It built up steadily across the show's run, episode after episode, until it became one of the most recognizable features of Family Guy as a whole. Fans and critics eventually gave this pattern its own informal name, referring to it as the everyone hates Meg dynamic, a shorthand that spread widely enough to become one of the most common ways people describe the character's role on the show. The phrase captures something real about how consistently the writers built entire scenes and jokes around Meg being disliked, mocked, or ignored by nearly every member of her own family. Certain episodes push this dynamic further than others. Episodes have shown Meg being physically shoved out of moving vehicles by her own family members, treated as an afterthought during major family events, and mocked directly to her face in ways that go well beyond ordinary sibling teasing. The show has repeatedly built entire scenes around the family agreeing out loud that Meg is the least valued or least liked person in the house, treating this as an accepted fact of life inside the Griffin home, rather than something anyone needs to defend or explain. One of the clearest and most direct examples of the show acknowledging its own pattern comes from an episode where the family actually sits down and discusses, among themselves, how badly they treat Meg. Rather than simply continuing the joke without comment, certain episodes have the characters step back and reflect on the fact that they have spent years being cruel to her, sometimes even apologizing briefly before returning to the same behavior soon after. This kind of self-awareness inside the show itself is worth paying attention to, because it shows that the writers were not simply blind to what they were doing with this character. They knew the pattern existed. They built jokes directly around the fact that it existed, and in some cases, they let the characters comment on it as something almost absurd in its consistency, treating the sheer scale of the mistreatment as its own kind of punchline.
Seth MacFarlane has spoken about this part of the show directly in interviews over the years,
acknowledging that the writers eventually felt the jokes aimed at Meg had gone further than they should have. This kind of admission from the person who created the show carries real weight, since it comes from someone with direct knowledge of how these decisions were made in the writer's room, rather than from an outside critic guessing at intent. MacFarlane's comments reflect a recognition that piling cruelty onto one character, season after season, eventually stopped feeling like ordinary sitcom teasing, and started feeling like something closer to genuine bullying, repeated so often that it became one of the defining features of the show, rather than a passing joke. This kind of reflection did lead to some real changes in how the show handled Meg in later seasons, though the pattern never disappeared completely. Certain episodes gave Meg more depth, more interior life, and more moments where the story treated her feelings as something worth taking seriously, rather than something to laugh past. These episodes tend to slow down around Meg in a way the show rarely does for its other characters outside of Brian, giving her scenes that focus on loneliness, self-esteem, and the specific pain of feeling unwanted inside your own family, without a joke arriving every few seconds to undercut the mood. One especially heavy example comes from an episode called Screams of Silence, which aired during the show's 9th season. This episode moves away from the show's usual comedic tone almost entirely, focusing on a storyline involving domestic abuse connected to Quagmire's father. Meg becomes involved in the story in a way that forces the show to treat abuse and control within a relationship with real seriousness, stripping out most of the usual jokes in favor of a much darker, more direct kind of storytelling. An episode willing to step that far outside its normal comedic rhythm, specifically in service of a story touching on Meg, shows that the writers were capable of treating her as a character worth real emotional investment when they chose to. This creates a strange and very specific kind of contrast running through the character's entire history on the show. Meg is, by a wide margin, the family member who receives the most casual cruelty from the people around her, mocked constantly for her appearance, her lack of a social life, and her general place at the bottom of the household's pecking order. At the same time, she is also one of the only characters, alongside Brian, who has been given genuinely serious material dealing with real emotional pain, treated with a level of seriousness the show rarely extends happens to characters like Chris or even Lois. Both of these things are true about the same character, often within the very same season, sometimes even within episodes released close together on the broadcast schedule. It helps to understand a little about how this pattern developed over time, rather than existing exactly the same way from the very first episode. Early seasons of Family Guy did include jokes at Meg's expense, but the intensity and frequency of these jokes grew noticeably as the show continued. What started as one kind of running joke among several eventually became one of the most consistent and most heavily used patterns across the entire series, showing up in episode after episode with a regularity that few other running jokes on the show can match.
This growth over time is part of why the pattern eventually became something the show's own creator felt was worth commenting on directly, since a joke repeated occasionally across a few episodes reads very differently from the same joke repeated constantly across more than a decade of episodes. Consider how this pattern compares to the way the show treats Stewie's history of plotting against Lois, covered earlier in this piece. Stewie's darkest material eventually became an actual plot with real stakes, playing out across 2 connected episodes before getting resolved and folded back into the ongoing world of the show. Meg's mistreatment does not work the same way. There is no single episode where the family's cruelty toward her reaches a dramatic peak and then gets resolved for good. Instead, the pattern simply continues, episode after episode, season after season, sometimes eased slightly by a more serious storyline like Screams of Silence, but never fully going away or reaching any kind of lasting conclusion inside the show's own story. This ongoing, unresolved quality is part of what makes Meg's situation different from almost everything else examined so far in this piece. Brian's death was a single event with a clear beginning, middle, and end, wrapped up within a tight 3-week window between 2 connected episodes. Stewie's attempt on Lois's life followed the same basic shape, building to a climax and then settling back into a stable resolution. Meg's mistreatment does not follow that kind of arc. It functions less like a single storyline and more like a permanent condition of the show itself, a running joke so deeply built into the format of Family Guy that removing it completely would change the basic shape of how the Griffin household operates on screen. This is also where the show's tendency towards self-awareness becomes especially interesting. A number of episodes have Meg herself directly calling out how badly her family treats her, sometimes in speeches that carry real anger and hurt, rather than simply serving as another joke at her expense. These moments do not erase the mistreatment that continues around them, but they do show that the show is capable of letting Meg's own perspective come through clearly when the writers choose to give her that space. She is not written as someone who simply absorbs the abuse without noticing or caring. She notices, she minds, and every so often, the show lets her say so directly, even while returning, often within the very same episode, to more of the same treatment that prompted her to speak up in the first place. Fans and critics discussing the show over the years have pointed to this pattern repeatedly as one of the clearest examples of Family Guy pushing a joke well past the point most other sitcoms would consider reasonable. Unlike some of the show's more one-time controversies, which tend to center on a single episode or a single joke that upset people at a specific moment, the treatment of Meg represents something different, a slow accumulation of cruelty spread across hundreds of episodes that only becomes fully visible when you step back and look at the show's entire run, rather than any single installment of it. Watching one episode, the jokes aimed at Meg might read as simply one more example of the show's general willingness to mock its own characters. Watching the show across its full history, the pattern becomes much harder to miss, and much harder to explain away as anything other than a deliberate, ongoing choice made by the people writing it. It is worth remembering, too, that this same show gave real weight and real seriousness to Meg's situation more than once, choosing in certain episodes to step outside its usual comedic register entirely in order to treat her pain as something genuine, rather than something to laugh at. Screams of Silence stands as clear, direct evidence that the writers were capable of doing this when they wanted to. The existence of episodes like this does not cancel out the years of casual cruelty that surround them, but it does complicate any simple reading of Meg as a character the show only ever uses as a punching bag. She has been both things at once, across the same run of episodes, sometimes within a matter of weeks on the broadcast schedule. The same pattern of contradiction running through nearly everything examined so far in this piece. McFarlane's own comments about eventually feeling the Meg jokes went too far add something important to this picture that is easy to overlook. This is not a case where outside critics alone raise concerns about how the show treated one of its own characters. This is the creator of the show, someone with direct authority over every decision made in the writer's room, publicly acknowledging that a specific, long-running pattern in his own series eventually crossed a line he was not comfortable with. That kind of admission from inside the show itself carries
carries more weight than almost any outside criticism could, since it confirms that the pattern was not simply a matter of audience perception or interpretation. The people making these decisions eventually agreed, at least to some extent, that they had gone further than they should have. None of this changes the basic fact that the pattern continued in various forms for years after those comments, and continues in smaller ways even now, long after the show first began softening its edges around Meg in certain episodes.
Old habits built into the basic structure of a long-running show do not disappear overnight, even once the people responsible for them start to recognize the problem. Family Guy has spent more than 2 decades building an entire identity around characters mocking and mistreating each other, and Meg, more than anyone else in the household, has absorbed the largest and steadiest share of that mistreatment across nearly the entire history of the series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything covered in this section stays largely contained within the walls of the Griffin house, a pattern of cruelty aimed at a fictional character by other fictional characters, with real consequences limited mostly to how audiences feel about watching it. What comes next moves the show's darker instincts into a completely different arena, away from the family and out into the real world, touching on an actual public figure and setting off a controversy that reached far beyond anything discussed inside the show itself. Section 6, the Sarah Palin and Trig controversy. Family Guy has built a reputation across more than 2 decades of episodes for touching on real-world figures and real-world controversies, often with very little hesitation about how a joke might land once it reaches the actual person or family connected to it. Most of the time, this kind of material passes through the news cycle quickly, generating a wave of reaction online before fading within a few days. One specific joke from 2010 did not fade quickly. It grew into a national story, pulled in a former vice presidential candidate, and eventually produced one of the most unusual public responses in the show's entire history, coming directly from the actress at the center of the joke itself. The episode responsible for all of this is called Extra Large Medium, which aired in February of 2010 as part of the show's 8th season. The episode introduces a character named Ellen, a young woman who has Down syndrome, brought into the story as a potential romantic interest for Chris Griffin. Family Guy made an unusual and specific casting choice for this character, giving the role to Andrea Faye Friedman, an actress who has Down syndrome in real life. This detail matters a great deal for everything that follows, since it means the character was not simply written and performed by someone imagining what that experience might be like from the outside. The voice behind Ellen belonged to someone actually living that reality. At one point in the episode, Ellen mentions her mother during conversation, describing her as the former governor of Alaska. This line does not name Sarah Palin directly, but the reference was immediately clear to anyone following American politics at the time. Sarah Palin had served as governor of Alaska before becoming the Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008, and she had spoken publicly on multiple occasions about her youngest son, Trig, who was born in 2008 with Down syndrome. Palin had built part of her public identity around her advocacy for children with special needs, discussing Trig's condition openly in interviews and speeches throughout her time in the national spotlight. Family Guy's joke worked by connecting these two pieces of public knowledge together, letting a character with Down syndrome describe her mother in a way that pointed directly at Palin without ever using her name. The reaction from the Palin family came quickly and publicly. Sarah Palin posted a response criticizing the joke, describing it as insulting to families raising children with special needs, and arguing that the show had picked an unfair target by mocking a vulnerable group for cheap laughs. Her daughter, Bristol Palin, also spoke out against the episode, adding her own criticism to her mother's. Both of these statements reached a wide audience quickly, since Sarah Palin remained one of the most closely watched political figures in the country at that time, and anything she said publicly tended to generate immediate coverage across news outlets and talk shows. This is where the story took an unusual turn, different from how most Family Guy controversies typically play out. Rather than the show's creators responding directly to defend the joke themselves, the response came instead from Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress who had voiced Ellen. Friedman released a public statement addressing Palin's criticism directly, explaining her own perspective on the joke as someone who actually has Down syndrome and had chosen to take on the role specifically because of what the episode was trying to do. Friedman's statement made a specific and pointed argument about where the actual joke was aimed. She explained that the humor in the scene did not come from mocking Ellen or her condition. Ellen, throughout the episode, is written and performed as confident, self-assured, and completely aware of herself, delivering her lines with the same casual ease as any other character on the show. The joke, according to Friedman, landed on Palin rather than on Ellen, since it was Palin's public connection to the line that made it funny, not
not anything about Ellen's disability itself. Friedman argued that this distinction mattered enormously, and that missing it meant misunderstanding the entire structure of the scene.
She went further, suggesting that Palin's reaction reflected a misunderstanding of the difference between humor built around a person's disability and humor that simply includes a character who happens to have a disability, written with the same confidence and personality as everyone else around her. Friedman framed her own involvement in the episode as a source of pride, rather than something she needed defending against, describing her experience working on the show in positive terms and standing by the decision to take the role in the first place. This response carried a particular kind of weight that is easy to overlook if you only skim the surface of the controversy. Most defenses of controversial jokes come from the writers, producers, or network executives responsible for making them, people whose job depends on defending their own work, regardless of how they personally feel about any specific criticism.
Friedman's statement came from someone entirely outside that structure, an actress with no obligation to defend the show, speaking from personal experience about a condition she actually lives with every day. Her willingness to publicly push back against one of the most recognizable political figures in the country, defending a joke connected to her own performance, gave the entire controversy a shape that few other Family Guy incidents have matched. News coverage of the disagreement between Palin and Friedman spread quickly across major outlets, discussed on cable news programs, and covered by newspapers well beyond the entertainment sections that normally handle stories about animated sitcoms. The controversy touched on several sensitive threads at once, involving disability, comedy, and a former vice presidential candidate defending her own family, all wrapped around a single line of dialogue from a half-hour cartoon. This combination made the story attractive to a much wider range of media outlets than the show's usual controversies typically reached,
since it offered several different angles that different audiences found compelling for different reasons. Some commentators sided with Palin, arguing that jokes referencing children with disabilities, even indirectly, cross a line that comedy should generally avoid, regardless of how the joke is structured or who delivers it. Others sided with Friedman and the show, arguing that a joke performed and endorsed by an actress who actually has the condition in question carries a different kind of legitimacy than the same joke would carry if written entirely by writers without that lived experience, then performed by an actor without any personal connection to it. This divide reflected a genuine and ongoing disagreement about where comedy involving disability should be allowed to go, a disagreement that did not resolve cleanly in either direction and continued to surface in later discussions of the episode for years afterward. It is worth sitting with how unusual it is for a controversy like this to produce a defense this specific and this personal. Many of the show's other controversial jokes over the years faded from public conversation within days, discussed briefly online before moving on to the next controversy in the news cycle. This particular disagreement stayed in public conversation longer than most, partly because of the ongoing back and forth between Palin's public statements and Friedman's response, and partly because the underlying question, whether a joke about disability changes meaning depending on who tells it and who performs it, touched on something broader than any single episode of any single show.
Family Guy's creators did not walk back the joke or apologize for airing it, a pattern that holds true across most of the show's controversies covered throughout this piece. The show's general approach across its history has been to stand by its material once it airs, rarely issuing formal apologies even when specific jokes generate significant public anger. In this particular case, the show did not need to mount its own defense as forcefully as it sometimes has elsewhere, since Friedman's statement effectively took on that role from a position the writers themselves could never have occupied. Having the actress at the center of the joke publicly explain and defend it gave the show a kind of cover that its usual approach of simply staying silent and moving forward would not have provided on its own. This controversy also connects back to something worth remembering from earlier in this piece regarding how Family Guy handles material involving real-world groups and real-world sensitivities. The show has never shied away from touching subjects that other programs treat far more carefully, whether that means Stewie's plans against his own mother, the casual cruelty aimed at Meg inside the Griffin household, or, in this case, a joke that reached directly into the family of a sitting national political figure. What makes the Palin and Trigg controversy distinct from those other examples is the specific nature of the response it produced, since very few of the show's other controversies have been met with a defense this detailed, this personal, and this directly tied to the actual lived experience of someone connected to the joke itself. There is also something worth noting about the timing and cultural moment surrounding this particular episode. Sarah Palin remained an enormously prominent figure in American politics in early 2010, having run for national office only a year and a half earlier and continuing to draw intense media attention, regardless of what she said or did. Any joke referencing her family during this period was almost guaranteed to generate significant coverage, simply because of how closely her every public statement was being tracked by media outlets across the political spectrum. Family Guy choosing to make this specific
specific joke at this specific moment guaranteed a much larger reaction than a similar joke aimed at a less prominent figure might have produced. Andrea Faye Friedman's involvement did not end with her public statement defending the episode. She continued to speak about the experience in later interviews, consistently describing her time on the show in positive terms and standing by her belief that the joke worked the way she had originally explained it.
Her willingness to keep discussing the controversy, rather than letting her original statement stand as a one-time response before moving on, kept her perspective part of the ongoing conversation about the episode for years after it first aired, giving this particular controversy a longer public life than most of the show's other disputes over specific jokes. This entire episode of public disagreement says something important about the specific kind of risk Family Guy takes on when it reaches beyond its own fictional world and touches real people and real families directly. Jokes aimed inward at the Griffin household itself generate reactions contained mostly to fans and critics discussing the show on its own terms. A joke aimed outward at an actual sitting political figure and her actual child carries consequences that spread far beyond the usual audience for the show, pulling in political commentators, disability advocates, and news outlets that would otherwise have no reason to discuss a Sunday night animated comedy at all. None of this means the show avoided this kind of material after 2010. Family Guy continued making jokes touching on real political figures and real controversies in the years that followed, following the same basic pattern established here, airing the material, absorbing whatever criticism followed, and rarely walking anything back through a formal apology. What makes the Palin and Trigg controversy worth examining closely within this piece is not that it changed the show's overall approach going forward, but that it produced one of the clearest and most specific illustrations of how contested this kind of humor can become once it moves from a fictional family into a real one, and how differently that contest can play out when someone with direct personal experience of the subject steps forward to defend it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The connection between this controversy and the episode that produced it deserves a closer look on its own terms, moving past the public disagreement itself and into the actual content of Extra Large Medium, examining what the show was trying to do with Ellen's character beyond the single line that sparked the entire national conversation. Section 7, Extra Large Medium and the Down Syndrome episode. The previous section focused mostly on the public fight that broke out around a single line of dialogue from Extra Large Medium, the reaction from Sarah Palin, and the response from Andrea Faye Friedman. Stepping back from that fight and looking at the episode itself on its own terms tells a slightly different and more complete story, one that says a lot about how Family Guy handles disability when it decides to give a character real screen time instead of just a passing joke. Extra Large Medium aired on February 14th, 2010 as part of the show's 8th season. The main plot of the episode follows Peter after he becomes convinced he has developed the ability to speak with the dead, leading him into a storyline built around psychic mediums, the kind of television personalities who claim to communicate with deceased loved ones on behalf of paying audiences. This part of the episode runs through the usual Family Guy formula, filled with exaggerated situations and quick jokes built around Peter's overconfidence in his new supposed ability. Running alongside that main plot is the storyline that produced the entire controversy discussed in the previous section, centered on Chris Griffin and a new character named Ellen. Chris meets Ellen, and the two begin a relationship, with the show framing this as a normal teenage romance, rather than treating Ellen's condition as the defining feature of the storyline. Ellen has Down syndrome, and the show chose to cast Andrea Faye Friedman, an actress who has Down syndrome herself, to voice the character, rather than casting an actor without any personal connection to the condition. This casting decision matters enormously to how the character actually plays on screen. Ellen speaks and carries herself with the same confidence and comic timing given to any other character in a Family Guy relationship storyline. She teases Chris, holds her own in conversation, and never once behaves as though her condition defines her personality or limits how she interacts with the people around her. The show does not build jokes around Ellen struggling with basic tasks or misunderstanding simple things, which is the kind of lazy, condition-based humor that disability advocates have long criticized in other media. Instead, Ellen operates as a fully formed character with her own personality, her own sense of humor, and her own comfort in her own skin. Chris, for his part, treats Ellen exactly the way he would treat any other girl he was interested in. The show does not frame his attraction to her as unusual or as something requiring explanation. There is no moment where another character questions Chris's choice or treats the relationship as strange because of Ellen's condition. This matters because it reflects a deliberate choice by the writers to normalize the relationship rather than turning Ellen's Down syndrome into the central joke or the central obstacle of the storyline. The humor in their scenes together comes from the same place Family Guy usually draws its romantic comedy from: awkward teenage nervousness
nervousness, mismatched expectations, and the general chaos of a Griffin family member trying to date someone new. The single line that caused the entire national controversy, where Ellen mentions that her mother used to be the governor of Alaska, arrives almost casually within this larger context. It is a brief moment inside a longer storyline built around two teenagers getting to know each other, not a scene constructed specifically to build toward that one joke.
Understanding where the line sits inside the actual episode helps explain part of what Andrea Faye Friedman was pointing to in her public defense of the joke. The humor depends entirely on the audience's outside knowledge connecting Ellen's mother to Sarah Palin. It does not depend on anything about Ellen herself, her condition, or how she is written throughout the rest of her scenes. This distinction is worth sitting with carefully, because it gets at something important about how comedy involving real-world references actually works. A joke that uses a character's background to point towards something happening outside the show is a different kind of joke than one built around mocking that same character directly for a personal trait. Extra Large Medium does the first thing, using Ellen's family background as a bridge toward a real political figure, while consistently avoiding the second thing throughout the rest of her time on screen.
Whether or not someone finds the specific joke about Palin appropriate, the character surrounding that joke was written with a level of respect and normalcy that stands out against how the show treats several of its other characters, including, as covered earlier in this piece, Meg. Seth MacFarlane and the writing team behind Family Guy have discussed this episode in interviews as one of the moments they felt reflected the kind of representation they wanted to bring to the show, treating Ellen's storyline as an example of getting something right rather than something they needed to defend after the fact. This distinguishes Extra Large Medium from several of the show's other controversial episodes, where the creators have sometimes acknowledged, as covered in the section on Meg, that certain jokes went further than they should have. Here, the defense of the episode rests less on damage control and more on a genuine belief that casting an actress with Down syndrome to play a character with Down syndrome and writing that character with real personality and agency represented the show doing something worthwhile. The episode also benefits from a detail easy to overlook amid all the attention paid to the Palin joke specifically. Andrea Faye Friedman was not brought in for a single scene or a token appearance. Ellen appears throughout the episode as a real presence in Chris's story, given enough screen time to establish her own voice and personality, rather than functioning as a brief cameo built entirely around one punchline. This gave the character room to exist as more than just a vehicle for controversy, even though the controversy is what most people remember about the episode today. It is worth comparing this approach to how television in general has historically handled characters with disabilities.
Representation of this kind has often leaned on non-disabled actors playing disabled characters, sometimes praised for their performances, while the actual community being represented had no direct involvement in shaping how that representation looked or sounded. Family Guy choosing to cast an actress who actually lives with Down syndrome, rather than simply writing the condition into a script and handing it to someone without that experience, reflects a choice that a number of critics and disability advocates have pointed to as a meaningfully different and more respectful approach, regardless of how they felt about the specific joke that followed. None of this erases the fact that the episode still produced one of the most heated public controversies in the show's history, discussed at length in the previous section. A well-written character and a respectful casting choice did not prevent the joke referencing Palin's family from becoming a national story, pulling in political commentary and disability advocacy groups from outside the show's usual audience entirely. Both things are true about Extra Large Medium at once. The episode gave a character with Down syndrome real depth, personality, and a storyline treated with genuine normalcy, while also containing the single line that produced one of the loudest and longest-running controversies the show has ever faced. This pairing, a genuinely thoughtful piece of representation, sitting directly next to one of the show's most contested jokes, fits the same pattern running through nearly every section of this piece so far. Family Guy rarely does only one thing at a time. The same episode that gave Andrea Faye Friedman a real extended role and treated her character with unusual care is the same episode that dragged a former vice presidential candidate and her family into a public fight over where comedy is allowed to go. Neither side of that combination cancels out the other, and looking at only one half of it gives an incomplete picture of what actually happened when this episode aired in February of 2010. There is also something worth noting about how the show chose to end Ellen's storyline within the episode, treating the relationship with Chris as a normal part of his ongoing life, rather than something requiring a dramatic resolution or a special lesson about acceptance tacked on to the end. Family Guy often resists moralizing, preferring to let its stories end on a joke rather than a lesson. An Extra Large Medium follows that same instinct here.
The show does not use Ellen's storyline as an opportunity to deliver a message about tolerance or understanding directly to the audience. It simply lets Chris date a girl he likes, lets that girl have her own personality and sense of humor, and moves on
on without turning the entire storyline into an after-school special about acceptance. Whether this restraint counts as a strength or a missed opportunity depends on what someone expects from a comedy touching on this kind of material in the first place. Some viewers might have wanted the show to address the significance of its casting choice more directly within the episode itself, using Ellen's storyline as a chance to say something explicit about representation.
Others might see the show's decision to simply treat the relationship as normal, without any speech or lesson attached to it, as the more respectful choice, since it avoids turning Ellen into a symbol and instead lets her function as a regular character within a regular storyline. Family Guy chose the second path, consistent with how it generally avoids direct moral messaging across most of its other storylines as well. Extra Large Medium stands, in the end, as one of the clearest single examples in the entire history of Family Guy of the show's core contradiction playing out inside one episode rather than across separate storylines. A thoughtful, well-cast character built with real care sits directly beside the joke that caused one of the loudest public fights the show has ever generated. Both are part of the same 22 minutes of television, airing on the same night, built by the same writers, and remembered today for very different reasons depending on which half of the episode someone chooses to focus on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same tension between genuine care and real controversy shows up again in a completely different corner of the show's history, this time centered not on disability, but on how Family Guy has handled jokes involving gay characters, drawing direct and repeated criticism from one of the most prominent advocacy organizations focused on media representation in the country. Section 8, Quagmire, GLAAD, and Real Criticism over LGBTQ jokes. Family Guy has spent more than 2 decades joking about almost every group of people imaginable, and jokes touching on gay and transgender characters have been part of the show since fairly early in its run. Unlike some of the other controversies covered in this piece, which came from a single episode or a single line, this particular thread runs across many years and involves a real advocacy organization speaking out more than once, along with the show's own creator eventually admitting, on record, that some of the material needed to change. The organization at the center of most of this criticism is GLAAD, which stands for the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. GLAAD is a real, established media watchdog group that has spent decades tracking how movies and television shows portray gay, lesbian, and transgender people, speaking out publicly when they believe a show has crossed into harmful territory. Unlike a random online complaint or a single critic's opinion, a statement from GLAAD carries weight because the organization exists specifically to study representation across the entertainment industry as a whole, comparing shows against each other and tracking patterns over time. The clearest and most direct example of GLAAD speaking out against Family Guy involves an episode called Quagmire's Dad, which aired on May 9th, 2010, during the show's 8th season. The episode centers on Glenn Quagmire, one of Peter's closest friends and neighbors, whose father returns to Quahog after a long absence. Quagmire's father, a former Navy officer named Dan, reveals that she has come out as a transgender woman, undergone gender-affirming surgery, and adopted the name Ida going forward. This storyline gave the show a chance to deal directly with a transgender character's identity, something relatively rare for a major network animated comedy at that point in television history. Parts of the episode handled this material with more sympathy than viewers might expect from a show known mostly for shock value. Ida is written, for much of the episode, as someone Quagmire respects and loves, still seeing her as the same parent who raised him, despite the change in her identity. The episode makes a point of treating Ida's status as a decorated military figure seriously, framing her past service as something Quagmire still takes pride in, even after learning about her transition. Several critics who reviewed the episode at the time noted that this part of the story treated the character with more warmth than the show's reputation might suggest. The controversy came from a different part of the same episode. Brian, without realizing who she is, ends up sleeping with Ida after meeting her away from the rest of the family. Once he learns the truth, the show has him vomit continuously for a stretch of roughly 30 seconds, an exaggerated reaction played for shock and laughs rather than any kind of quiet emotional beat. On top of this, other characters in the episode, including Peter and Lois, make comments about Ida using language and framing that many viewers and critics read as disrespectful toward transgender people, treating her identity as something strange or lesser rather than something to simply accept. GLAAD responded to the episode directly through an official statement, saying that the organization shared the serious concerns being raised by members of the LGBTQ community, and confirming that its entertainment media team was addressing the situation directly with Fox, the network that aired the show. This is a significant detail, since it means GLAAD did not simply post criticism online and move on. The organization treated the episode seriously enough to open a direct line of communication with the network responsible for broadcasting it, a step reserved for material the organization considers worth escalating beyond
beyond a public statement alone.
Seth MacFarlane responded to the backlash in an interview with Details magazine later that year, expressing genuine surprise at how strongly people had reacted. He said directly that he did not meet a lot of stupid homosexuals, using that phrase to argue that he still believed Ida had been written as a sympathetic and intelligent character overall. He continued defending the episode, specifically addressing the vomiting scene by comparing Brian's reaction to how a gay man might feel encountering something outside his own attraction, framing the joke as an attempt at a kind of parallel discomfort rather than an attack on transgender people specifically. This response did not satisfy many of the critics who had raised concerns in the first place.
Writers covering LGBTQ media at the time argued that MacFarlane's explanation missed the actual complaint, since the issue was not really about Brian's individual reaction as a character, but about the surrounding pattern of jokes and comments throughout the episode that treated Ida's identity itself as something worth mocking rather than simply depicting. Some critics gave the episode credit for attempting a genuine and even groundbreaking storyline about a transgender parent, while still describing specific scenes, especially the vomiting sequence and the family's disrespectful comments, as going too far in the opposite direction. Quagmire's dad is not the only piece of evidence in this pattern, though it stands as the clearest single flashpoint involving Glad by name. Family Guy has produced other storylines over the years dealing with gay characters and gay relationships, some praised even by critics who otherwise find plenty to criticize about the show.
An episode called Family Gay, which aired in 2009, follows Peter Griffin after he takes an experimental drug that turns him gay for the length of the episode, built around a doctor's claim that the change proves sexuality comes from something fixed rather than a choice someone makes. Even critics who found parts of the episode crude in its execution acknowledged that its underlying message, arguing directly against the idea that being gay is a choice, took a clear and, for the time, fairly bold position. This same pattern of contradiction runs through how the show has written Herbert, an elderly neighbor character who has appeared since the show's early seasons with an ongoing attraction to Chris, one of the Griffin children. The show plays this attraction almost entirely as a running joke about an old man's inappropriate interest in a teenage boy, repeated across dozens of episodes over many years.
Critics writing about the show's handling of LGBTQ material have pointed to Herbert directly as one of the most uncomfortable and least defensible running jokes in the entire series, since the humor depends entirely on treating an older man's attraction to a minor as something to laugh at, rather than something the show ever takes seriously as a real danger. Stewie's own story adds another layer to this pattern. For many years, the show hinted at Stewie's sexuality without ever settling the question directly, often using jokes about his uncertain orientation as another source of humor, rather than character development. This changed in 2018, when an episode allowed Stewie to come out more directly, a moment that a number of critics and outlets covering the show described as one of its strongest and most surprising outings in years, treating the moment with more sincerity than the show usually allows itself. This episode arrived after years of the show using Stewie's sexuality mostly as a punchline, which makes the eventual, more sincere treatment stand out by comparison. The clearest and most direct sign that the show's own producers recognized a real problem with how they had been writing this material came in January of 2019 during an episode called Trump Guy. In the episode, Peter Griffin, working as a press secretary in a storyline involving a cartoon version of Donald Trump, is told directly that many children learned their favorite jokes about Jewish people, black people, and gay people from watching the show over the years. Peter responds by saying that the show has, in fairness, been trying to phase out the gay jokes. This line inside the episode was not just a passing joke referencing the show's own history. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, two of the show's executive producers, confirmed directly in interviews around the same time that this reflected a real, deliberate shift happening behind the scenes. Sulkin stated plainly that comparing an episode from 2005 or 2006 to one from 2018 or 2019 would reveal real differences, explaining that material the writers once felt comfortable including was something they now recognized as no longer acceptable. This is about as direct an admission as any long-running comedy has made about deliberately walking back a specific category of its own jokes, coming straight from the people who actually run the writer's room, rather than from outside pressure alone. This announcement did not mean every joke touching on gay or transgender characters disappeared from the show immediately or completely. Critics covering the show in the years following this statement pointed out episodes that still leaned on familiar stereotypes. Sometimes within the very same season the phase-out was first announced. Writers covering LGBTQ entertainment specifically noted that jokes involving transgender characters in particular did not slow down at the same pace as jokes about gay men, arguing that the show's actual behavior after 2019 did not fully match the promise made inside the Trump Guy episode. This
gap between a public statement and the show's continued output over the following seasons became its own smaller point of discussion among people who track the series closely. Taken together, this entire thread shows a pattern that fits closely with everything else covered throughout this piece.
Family Guy has, at different points, produced material that GLAAD and other advocacy voices have pushed back against directly. Material that even the show's own producers eventually admitted needed to change. And material that a number of critics have praised as genuinely sympathetic and even ahead of its time for a major network comedy. None of these things happened in isolation from each other. Often, as with Quagmire's dad, the sympathetic material and the criticized material sat inside the exact same episode, the same 22 minutes, built by the same writers working on the same storyline. This mirrors almost exactly the shape of the extra-large medium controversy covered earlier in this piece, where a thoughtfully cast and written character sat directly beside the joke that caused the loudest public reaction.
Quagmire's dad follows that same structure, giving Ida real dignity through much of her storyline, while still producing the vomiting scene and the disrespectful family comments that drew GLAAD's direct attention. The show, across more than 2 decades, keeps returning to this same basic pattern, mixing real sympathy with material that draws real, organized criticism, often within the same block of episodes, rather than in separate, easily divided categories. What makes this particular thread stand out from some of the show's other controversies is the length of time involved, and the fact that the show itself eventually admitted, publicly and directly, that a specific category of its jokes had gone further than it should have. Most of Family Guy's controversies fade after a period of public discussion, with the show rarely offering any formal change in direction afterward.
The 2019 phase-out announcement stands as one of the clearer moments where the show's own producers acknowledged, in their own words, that years of a specific kind of joke needed to be scaled back, even if the follow-through in later seasons did not fully match the scale of that promise. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same willingness to test how far a joke can go, regardless of who it targets, shows up again in a completely different form, moving away from Quagmire's extended family and into a single cutaway scene that became one of the clearest examples of the show reaching for real tragedy purely for a laugh. Section 9. The Cleveland, Loretta Quagmire, and the AIDS Joke Backlash. Family Guy has spent its entire run testing exactly how far a joke can go before an audience pushes back hard enough to make news. Most of those tests fade quickly, discussed for a few days online before the show moves on to its next target. One particular scene, buried inside an episode most casual viewers have long forgotten, became one of the clearest examples of the show reaching past what even its most loyal defenders were willing to laugh at. The episode in question is called The Cleveland, Loretta Quagmire, which aired during the show's 5th season. The main plot follows Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's close friends and neighbors at the time, after he discovers his wife Loretta is having an affair with Glenn Quagmire, another neighbor already well known on the show for his exaggerated, relentless pursuit of women. The storyline itself follows a fairly standard sitcom shape, built around betrayal, confrontation, and the fallout of an affair between people who all live on the same street. The scene that caused the real trouble arrives away from that main plot entirely.
In a separate cutaway sequence, Peter is shown standing with a barbershop quartet, singing and dancing cheerfully around the bed of a man dying from complications of AIDS in its late stage. The scene plays the moment for pure comedy, using the choreography and the song itself as the joke, set directly against the image of a man in the final stage of a fatal illness. There is no larger point being made about the disease, no character learning anything, no twist that reframes the scene afterward. It exists purely as a shot cutaway, one of hundreds the show has produced over the years, except this one landed with a different kind of weight than most. Critics writing about Family Guy's history of controversial material have pointed to this specific scene repeatedly as one of the clearest examples of the show using a serious, real-world illness purely as a punchline, without any of the surrounding context that sometimes softens similarly dark material elsewhere in the series.
Unlike the extra-large medium episode covered earlier in this piece, where a real disability was paired with a character written with genuine depth and personality, the AIDS scene in this episode offers no equivalent balance. The dying man has no name, no personality, and no purpose beyond serving as the backdrop for a joke about the absurdity of a barbershop quartet performance happening in the wrong setting. This scene fits a pattern that runs through much of the criticism aimed at Family Guy's cutaway format specifically. The show has built much of its identity around brief, unconnected scenes that interrupt the main plot for a quick joke before immediately returning to the story. A
structure that gives the writers enormous freedom to reach for almost any subject without needing to build context or justify the joke within the larger episode. Critics have argued that this format, while responsible for some of the show's sharpest and most memorable moments, also allows the writers to reach for shock value with very little accountability, since a cutaway lasting only a few seconds rarely receives the same scrutiny a full storyline would. The Parents Television Council, an advocacy group that has criticized Family Guy since its earliest seasons, pointed to jokes of this kind repeatedly across the show's run, filing complaints with the Federal Communications Commission on multiple occasions and naming the show as one of the worst on television in various years, specifically because of this pattern of using real tragedies and real diseases as throwaway material. While the Parents Television Council's criticisms cover a much wider range of complaints than any single scene, the AIDS joke in The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire is frequently cited by name in write-ups discussing the group's ongoing complaints about the show, treated as a clear example of exactly the kind of material the organization spent years trying to draw attention to. What makes this particular scene worth examining closely, within the larger question this piece is built around, is how little the show gains from including it. Unlike Stewie's plans against Lois, which eventually became a real, consequential storyline, or the Meg pattern, which at least connects to an ongoing character the show returns to again and again, the AIDS joke exists as an isolated moment with no connection to anything before or after it. It does not build toward anything. It does not reveal anything about Peter or any other character.
It exists purely as a test of how far the show could push a single joke, disconnected from any larger purpose within the episode carrying it. This isolation is part of what makes it a useful example of the harder edge running through Family Guy's history, separate from the more complicated cases covered earlier in this piece. Sarah Palin's family, Ida's storyline, and Meg's ongoing mistreatment all carry layers of context, defenders, and, in some cases, real depth sitting alongside the material that upset people. The AIDS scene offers none of that. It stands as one of the clearest, least defended examples of the show simply reaching for the darkest possible subject available and using it for a laugh, without any of the balancing material that softens some of the show's other controversial choices. Family Guy's willingness to produce a scene this strips down, this disconnected from any larger point, says something about how far the show has always been willing to go once it decides a subject is fair game for a joke. Whether the target is a real political family, a real advocacy group's concerns, or, in this case, a fictional stranger dying of a real and devastating disease, the show rarely pulls back once it is committed to a bit, a pattern that shows up again and again across the 10 sections this piece has now covered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to reach for the darkest possible version of a joke, regardless of what softens it or protects it from lasting criticism, shows up in an entirely different form in the very next chapter of this piece, moving away from a single cutaway gag and into the movie that carries the same contradiction the entire series has built its identity around. Section 10, Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, the same duality compressed into one movie. Family Guy released its first standalone film on September 27, 2005, under the title Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. This was not a theatrical release. It went straight to DVD, arriving at a point when the show had already survived its second cancellation and was firmly back in production for new seasons on Fox. The film ran 88 minutes, considerably longer than a normal episode, and gave the writers room to build a single connected story around Stewie, rather than splitting his material across separate, unrelated plots the way a normal episode usually does. The film began its life differently than most people realize. It was originally written as 3 separate segments, each handled by a different writer, titled Stewie Be Good, Bango Was His Name O, and Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure. These 3 pieces were stitched together into one continuous film for the DVD release, before later being cut apart again, trimmed down, and aired on Fox as 3 separate episodes making up the season 4 finale in May of 2006. Knowing this helps explain why the film feels like it moves through several distinct chapters rather than one smooth, single story, since that is exactly how it was built from the start. The plot opens with Stewie surviving a near-death experience after a lifeguard chair falls on him at a community pool, following a scheme where he had tried to hurt another boy out of jealousy over a swimming competition. The accident sends Stewie
Stewie into a vision of hell, and coming back from that vision leaves him shaken enough to promise he will try to be good from now on. This attempt at kindness does not last very long, which fits the pattern the show usually follows with Stewie's character, but it does set up the emotional core the rest of the film returns to again and again, the question of who Stewie really is underneath all his scheming and violence. The main plot kicks in when Stewie and Brian are watching television and spot a man in San Francisco who looks and sounds exactly like Stewie. Convinced that this man must be his real father, since Stewie has never been proud of Peter as a parent, Stewie becomes determined to travel across the country and meet him.
This search becomes the emotional spine of the entire film, giving Stewie a genuine, understandable motivation that has nothing to do with plotting or violence. He simply wants to know if there is someone out there who actually shares something real with him, someone who might explain who he is supposed to become. Getting to San Francisco becomes its own extended adventure. Brian and Stewie learn that Quagmire is setting out on a cross-country trip with the stated goal of being intimate with a different woman in every state, and the two of them hitch a ride in his vehicle to make the journey west. Along the way, Quagmire ends up handcuffed and robbed at a motel in New Jersey, and rather than help him, Stewie and Brian simply take the vehicle and continue on without him. The trip includes a stretch where Stewie, high on pills he got from a trucker, drives off the road, leaving the pair stranded in the desert until Brian talks him through giving up and finding another way forward.
This stretch of the film matters for the same reason the earlier Road to episodes discussed in Section 2 matter. Stripped away from the rest of the family, forced to depend entirely on each other to solve an actual problem, Brian and Stewie once again show the same steady friendship built up across the series. Brian is the one who keeps Stewie moving when he wants to quit. Stewie, despite everything else going on around him, keeps choosing to stay close to Brian rather than push him away. The same pattern established clearly in the Bank Vault episode and the various Road to trips. Once they finally reach San Francisco, Stewie tracks down the man from the television and confronts him directly, only to discover the truth. The man is not his father at all. He is Stewie himself, 30 years in the future, taking a vacation using time travel, which the film establishes as a normal thing people in this future are able to do. This twist reframes everything that came before it.
Stewie was never really searching for a father. He was searching for proof that his life could turn out to mean something. And what he found instead was a direct look at exactly what he might become if nothing changes. What Stewie sees in his future self is not encouraging. The adult version of himself, who goes by the name Stu, is living a small, disappointing life, working an ordinary retail job, still a virgin in his mid-30s, and clearly unhappy with how things turned out. Baby Stewie's reaction to this discovery carries real weight, since the film treats his disappointment and frustration with his future self as something genuine, rather than simply another joke. He is looking at a version of his own life that he does not want, and the film lets that sit as an actual source of tension rather than brushing past it quickly. Stewie decides to take action, working to change Stu's future by pushing him toward the kind of confidence and success he feels his older self is missing. This section of the film plays out with real sincerity mixed into the comedy, giving Stewie something close to an actual arc, a baby trying to fix the life of the adult he is going to become, motivated by nothing more selfish than wanting his own future to be worth living. By the time Stewie returns to his own time, having changed what Stu's life looks like going forward, the film treats this as a genuine resolution rather than another dead-end joke. Running alongside all of this is a separate storyline involving Peter and Lois, who spend much of the film trying to find privacy in their own home, while also worrying about teaching Chris and Meg how to date. This subplot leans much further into the show's usual comedic style, filled with awkward lessons and misguided parenting advice, giving the film room to still feel like a typical Family Guy episode, even while the Stewie and Brian storyline carries more emotional weight than usual. The film also includes a fictional premiere sequence, bookending the whole story, featuring appearances from recurring background characters and celebrity cameos, along with a handful of parody sequences referencing other well-known films and franchises throughout. One especially memorable moment involves a cutaway showing a version of Jesus performing simple finger tricks in a style modeled after a specific stage performer's well-known act. This particular gag later led to a real lawsuit filed in December of 2007 by the performer whose act had been referenced, accusing Seth MacFarlane and the production companies behind the film of copyright infringement and seeking more than $2 million in damages. That lawsuit was eventually settled out of court in 2010, with the specific terms of the settlement kept private. This detail shows that even a seemingly small, quick joke buried inside a much longer film could carry real-world legal consequences years after the film first aired. Sitting back from the specific plot details, this film works as a clean, compact version of everything this entire piece has been building toward across 9 earlier sections. Inside the same
same 88 minutes, Stewie's genuine vulnerability, his real desire to be understood and to matter to someone, sits directly next to his casual willingness to abandon Quagmire at a motel without a second thought. Brian and Stewie's friendship carries real weight through the desert sequence and the search for Stu, the same steady bond built across years of earlier episodes covered in Section 2. And the film still finds room for the kind of shock humor and quick disposable jokes that run through nearly every other section of this piece, proving that even when the show slows down enough to give Stewie something close to genuine emotional growth, it never fully lets go of its instinct to reach for a joke, regardless of how dark or strange that joke might be.
Critics who reviewed the film at the time generally agreed it worked best as a collection of strong individual moments, rather than as one tightly built story, with some noting that its length made it harder to sustain interest compared to a normal episode. That criticism makes sense, given how the film was originally built, 3 separate segments stitched together, rather than written from the start as one continuous whole. Even with that structural weakness, the film still manages to hold on to the exact contradiction running through everything covered in this piece: genuine feeling and casual cruelty occupying the same space, often within the very same scene, refusing to let either side fully cancel out the other. That refusal is the whole point this piece has been making, from the very first section onward. Family Guy survived 2 real cancellations because people loved it enough to fight for it.
It built one of its steadiest relationships around a dog and a baby who genuinely understand each other.
It also produced a wrongful conviction storyline built on years of matricide jokes, a mother figure absorbing constant abuse from nearly everyone in her own house, a real controversy involving a former vice presidential candidate, real criticism from an actual advocacy organization, and a cutaway joke about a dying man that needed no context at all to land as cruel. All 10 of these threads sit inside the same 25 years of the same show, made by the same people. None of them explain Family Guy by themselves. Taken together, they explain why this show has spent more than 2 decades being loved, defended, criticized, and argued about, often by the very same people, sometimes over the very same episode. That is not a contradiction the show ever needed to solve.
It is simply what Family Guy has always been: nice and toxic at once, running side by side, episode after episode, for 25 years.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.